My name is Junia Calhoun, and I am 64 years old. These hands you see before you, wrinkled and scarred, have picked more cotton than I could ever count, scrubbed more floors than exist in all the fine houses of Virginia, and endured more pain than any human soul should bear. But these same hands also lit the fire that changed everything. I tell you this story not for sympathy, but so you understand what it means to be pushed beyond the breaking point, to reach that moment when survival demands action, no matter the cost. It was a humid August morning in 1863 when everything began to unravel. I had been the property of the Whitfield family for 42 years, since I was 22 years old, sold away from my mother and sisters in South Carolina. Master Whitfield owned a sprawling plantation outside Richmond with tobacco fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. The big house sat on a hill, white columns gleaming in the morning sun, mocking those of us who lived in the cramped quarters behind it. That morning, I was carrying water from the well to the main house. My hip had been bothering me for weeks, an old injury from when I fell in the fields years ago, never properly healed. The bucket was heavy, my arms trembling with the weight. I was careful, always so careful, because I knew what happened when things went wrong. But as I climbed the back steps to the kitchen, my foot caught on a loose board. The bucket lurched forward, and water splashed across the wooden porch, seeping through the cracks. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It was just water on wood that would dry within the hour under the hot Virginia sun. But I knew better than to believe such logic would save me. In this world, in this life, the smallest mistake could bring down the worst punishment upon us. We were not allowed to be human, to stumble, to err. We were expected to be perfect machines, working without rest, without complaint, without fault. Mistress Whitfield appeared in the doorway, her face already twisted with rage. She was a thin woman with sharp features, her gray hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her skin. Her pale blue eyes held no warmth, no mercy. I had learned to read those eyes over the years, to know when a storm was coming. "You clumsy fool," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "Do you know how much that water cost? Do you know the effort it takes to maintain these floors?" I kept my eyes down, as we were taught to do. "I'm sorry, ma'am. My foot caught on the board. I'll clean it right away." But apologies meant nothing here. They never did. She called for her husband, and I felt my stomach drop. Master Whitfield was a large man, red-faced and quick to anger. He believed firmly in what he called discipline, though there was nothing disciplined about the brutal violence he inflicted upon us. He came out onto the porch, took one look at the wet boards, and his jaw tightened. "Bring her to the barn," he said simply, and those 4 words sealed my fate for the afternoon. 2 of the overseers grabbed my arms, though I did not resist. There was no point. Resistance only made things worse. They dragged me across the yard, past the other enslaved people who quickly averted their eyes. They had seen this before. We all had. The barn loomed ahead, dark and smelling of hay and manure. Inside, they tied my wrists to a post, pulling my arms above my head until my shoulders screamed in protest. Master Whitfield entered behind us, carrying the whip. It was made of thick leather, with metal tips designed to tear flesh. I had felt it before, years ago, and the scars still marked my back. I closed my eyes and tried to prepare myself for what was coming. But how does one prepare for such pain? The first strike came without warning, an explosion of fire across my back that made me gasp. I bit down hard on my lip, refusing to give them the satisfaction of hearing me scream. The second strike followed quickly, then the third. I lost count after 7, lost myself in the agony that consumed every inch of my being. My vision blurred, my knees buckled, and still the whip kept falling. When it finally stopped, I hung limply from the post, barely conscious. They cut me down, and I collapsed onto the dirt floor, my back a mass of torn flesh and blood. Someone threw a bucket of salt water on my wounds, and I did scream then, unable to hold it back. The pain was beyond description, beyond endurance. They left me there for hours, lying in my own blood on the barn floor. Other enslaved people snuck in when they could, bringing me water, whispering words of comfort. Old Martha, who had been here longer than anyone, carefully cleaned my wounds with strips of cloth. Her hands were gentle, but her eyes were hard with fury. "This ain't right," she whispered. "Never has been, never will be. But our day is coming, child. Mark my words." As I lay there, something shifted inside me. I had endured so much over the years, had swallowed my rage, had survived by making myself small and invisible. But as the pain radiated through my body, as I tasted blood in my mouth and felt the sticky warmth on my back, something broke. Or perhaps something finally became whole. I realized with absolute clarity that I could not continue like this, that survival at any cost was no longer enough. That night, as I drifted in and out of consciousness, my mind began to work. The big house, with its fine furniture and expensive draperies, the master and mistress sleeping peacefully in their soft beds while I bled on a barn floor. The injustice of it burned hotter than my wounds. And in that burning, an idea began to form. They had taken everything from me: my freedom, my family, my dignity, my very humanity. They had beaten me for spilling water as if I were less than nothing. But I still had one thing they could never take: my will. And I would use it to strike back in the only way that mattered. 3 days passed before I could stand upright without crying out in pain. The wounds on my back were infected despite Martha's care, weeping and hot to the touch. But I forced myself to work, knowing that showing weakness would only invite more punishment. I moved through my tasks like a ghost, carrying water, scrubbing floors, preparing food in the kitchen. All the while, my mind was working, planning, calculating. The big house had stood for nearly 60 years, a monument to wealth built on our suffering. I knew every inch of it, every room, every hallway. I had cleaned those spaces 1,000 times, polished the banisters, swept the floors, dusted the portraits of Whitfield ancestors who stared down with the same cold eyes as their descendants. I knew where the expensive curtains hung, where the rugs lay thick and plush, where the master kept his important papers in the study. I also knew the house's weaknesses. The kitchen was connected to the main house by a covered walkway, close enough that heat and smoke from cooking fires sometimes drifted into the dining room. The curtains in the parlor were old, dried by years of sunlight streaming through the windows. The wooden floors were treated with oil to make them shine. Everything in that house was designed for beauty and comfort, with no thought to safety. It would burn beautifully, but I had to be careful. Planning something like this required absolute secrecy. If anyone suspected what I was thinking, I would be killed immediately. Worse, others might be punished for my intentions. The masters were always looking for conspiracies among us, always ready to make examples. I could not risk bringing their wrath down on the entire community. I began to observe the patterns of the household more carefully. Master Whitfield retired to his study each evening after dinner, where he drank whiskey and read newspapers. Mistress Whitfield went to bed early, claiming various ailments that required rest. The house slaves finished their duties around 9 o'clock and returned to the quarters. By 10, the house was quiet, with only the master still awake downstairs. The overseers made their rounds at specific times, checking the quarters to ensure no one was missing. But there was a gap, a window of perhaps 30 minutes around midnight when the rotation changed and the yard was briefly unwatched. That would be my opportunity. I needed supplies. Rags soaked in the cooking oil we used in the kitchen, kindling from the woodpile, perhaps some of the lamp oil if I could take it without being noticed. These items had to be gathered slowly, carefully, over many days. A rag here, a bit of kindling there, hidden beneath my skirt or in my apron pockets. I stored everything in a hollow beneath the floorboards of my sleeping space in the quarters, a spot I had discovered years ago. Martha watched me with knowing eyes. She was over 70 years old, had lived through horrors I could barely imagine. One evening, as we sat outside the quarters after our work was done, she spoke quietly. "I see something in your eyes, Junia. Something I recognize because I've felt it myself many times. Whatever you're thinking, you be careful. They will kill you without hesitation." I met her gaze. "They've already killed me, Martha. They killed who I was the day they put me in chains. What's left is just breathing, and breathing ain't the same as living." She nodded slowly. "I know that feeling. Lord knows I do. But think about the others here. Think about what they might do to everyone if something happens. I am thinking about them, I said. I'm thinking about how we all live in fear, how we all carry these scars. I'm thinking that maybe someone needs to show them that we ain't just going to accept this forever, that there's a cost to treating people like animals. Martha was silent for a long moment. Then she reached out and squeezed my hand. I won't ask what you're planning, but I'll tell you this. If you're going to do something, make it count. Make sure they remember. Over the next 2 weeks, I continued my preparations. I studied the wind patterns, noting that the prevailing breeze came from the west, which would push flames away from the quarters and toward the rest of the big house. I memorized the locations of every water barrel, knowing the masters would try to fight the fire once it started. I thought through every possible scenario, every outcome. The war had been raging for over 2 years now. We heard whispers of Union victories, of enslaved people escaping to freedom behind northern lines. Some of the younger men in the quarters talked of running away, of making it to the Union Army. But I was 64 years old, with a bad hip and a scarred back. Running was not an option for me. If I was going to strike back, it had to be here, now, in a way that mattered. I thought about my mother, sold away from me before I ever got to say goodbye. I thought about my children, 3 of them, all sold to different plantations when they were still young. I thought about the baby I lost when Mistress Whitfield worked me too hard during my pregnancy, refusing to let me rest. I thought about every humiliation, every beating, every moment of degradation over 42 years. The rage inside me had transformed into something cold and focused. This was not about revenge in the heat of anger. This was about justice, about making a statement that could not be ignored. When that house burned, people would know that somewhere in Virginia, an enslaved woman said enough, that she refused to accept her oppression silently, that she fought back the only way she could. On September 15th, I decided the time had come. There was no particular reason for choosing that date except that I was ready, and waiting longer only increased the risk of discovery. That evening, I went through my normal routine, serving dinner, cleaning the dishes, preparing the house for the night. I moved slowly, my back still aching from the whipping, but my mind was clear. As I worked in the kitchen, I gathered my supplies from their hiding places. The oil-soaked rags went into a small sack I could hide beneath my dress. The kindling was already positioned near the kitchen, where it would not seem suspicious. I had a flint and steel, taken from the kitchen months ago and never missed. When the evening tasks were completed, I returned to the quarters with the others. We shared a simple meal of cornmeal and fatback. I ate slowly, savoring it, knowing this might be my last meal as a living woman. The others talked quietly about the day's work, about news from the war, about small hopes and dreams. I listened, committing their voices to memory. Martha caught my eye across the fire. She knew. Somehow she knew tonight was the night. She gave me the smallest nod, a gesture of understanding and solidarity. I nodded back. When darkness fell completely and the others settled in for sleep, I lay on my thin mat and waited. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. I listened to the sounds of breathing around me, the familiar creaks and rustles of the quarters at night. My heart beat steadily, surprisingly calm. I had made my decision, and there was peace in that certainty. At last, midnight approached. I rose silently, gathering my hidden sack. I slipped out of the quarters, moving like a shadow across the yard. The moon was a thin crescent, providing just enough light to see by, but not enough to reveal me easily. I reached the kitchen and paused, listening for any sign of the overseers. Nothing. The night was quiet except for the chirping of crickets and the distant call of an owl. I entered the kitchen, my hands steady as I began to work. The kitchen was dark, except for the faint glow of embers in the cooking hearth. I knew this space intimately, had worked here countless times preparing meals for the Whitfield family while my own stomach growled with hunger. Tonight, it would serve a different purpose. My hands moved with practiced efficiency, pulling the oil-soaked rags from my sack and positioning them strategically. I placed the first bundle near the curtains that separated the kitchen from the covered walkway leading to the main house. The fabric was old and would catch quickly. Another bundle went beneath the wooden preparation table, where kindling and dry herbs were stored. A third I positioned near the shelves holding sacks of flour and dried goods. Everything was designed to create multiple points of ignition, to spread the fire faster than it could be contained. My heart was pounding now, but my hands remained steady. There was no room for hesitation, no space for doubt. I had crossed a line in my mind weeks ago, during those hours lying on the barn floor with my back torn open. This was simply the completion of a decision already made. I took the flint and steel from my apron pocket. For a moment, I paused, looking around the kitchen one last time. How many thousands of meals had I prepared here? How many times had I stood at this hearth, cooking food I was not allowed to taste? How many hours of my life had been spent in service to people who saw me as property, as something less than human? I struck the flint against the steel. Sparks flew, landing on the oil-soaked rag near the curtains. At first, nothing happened, and I felt a momentary panic. But then, a small flame appeared, growing larger as it fed on the oil. I moved quickly to the next bundle, striking sparks until it too began to burn. Then the third. The flames spread faster than I had anticipated. Within moments, the curtains were ablaze, fire climbing toward the wooden beams of the ceiling. The heat intensified quickly, forcing me to step back. Smoke began to fill the kitchen, thick and acrid. I watched for just a few seconds more, ensuring the fire had taken hold and would not simply burn out. Then I turned and moved toward the door. But I did not run back to the quarters. Not yet. I walked calmly through the covered walkway, watching as flames began to lick at the wooden posts supporting the roof. The fire was reaching toward the main house now, exactly as I had planned. Through the windows, I could see into the dark parlor, with its expensive furniture and thick curtains. Soon, all of it would be consumed. I thought about Mistress Whitfield's face when she had called me a clumsy fool. I thought about Master Whitfield's hand on the whip, the satisfaction in his eyes as he tore my flesh. I thought about all the masters and mistresses like them who built their comfort on our suffering, who slept peacefully while we bled and died. Let them wake up now. Let them feel fear for once. Let them understand what it means to lose everything. A shout came from inside the house. Someone had smelled the smoke. I heard footsteps, rapid and panicked. It was time for me to go. I moved quickly now, crossing the yard toward the quarters. Behind me, I heard more shouting, saw lights appearing in the windows of the big house. The alarm was spreading. I reached the quarters and slipped inside, moving to my sleeping mat. My hands were shaking now, adrenaline finally catching up with me. I lay down and pulled my thin blanket over me, forcing my breathing to slow. Around me, others were beginning to stir, disturbed by the commotion outside. "What's happening?" someone asked sleepily. "Fire," another voice answered. "Fire in the big house." People began to rise, moving to the door to look out. I stayed where I was, feigning sleep, though my heart was racing. Through the cracks in the walls, I could see an orange glow growing brighter. The fire was spreading exactly as I had hoped, consuming the house that had stood as a symbol of our oppression for so long. Martha came and knelt beside me. "Junia," she whispered, "you need to wake up. There's a fire." I opened my eyes and looked at her. She knew. The understanding passed between us silently. I sat up slowly, wincing as the movement pulled at my still healing back. "A fire?" I said, keeping my voice neutral. "The big house is burning," she said. "Everyone's going out to help fight it. You should stay here, with your back being hurt and all. No one will expect you to help." It was a gift, an alibi. I nodded gratefully. "You're right. I don't think I could carry water buckets anyway." She squeezed my shoulder gently and then moved away to join the others rushing outside. I rose slowly and went to the doorway, standing in the shadows where I could watch but not be clearly seen. The sight was magnificent and terrible. The big house was fully engulfed now, flames shooting from the windows, the roof beginning to collapse. The fire lit up the night sky, turning everything orange and red. Master Whitfield stood in the yard in his nightclothes, screaming orders that no one could hear over the roar of the flames. Mistress Whitfield was being held back by one of the overseers, her face streaked with tears as she watched her home burn. The enslaved people formed a water line from the well, passing buckets hand to hand, throwing water on the flames. But it was useless. The fire was too large, too hot, too well established. All they could do was try to prevent it from spreading to the outbuildings and the quarters. The big house itself was lost. I watched it burn with a sense of profound satisfaction. This was not just a house burning. This was a statement, a defiant act of resistance. For 42 years, I had been forced to submit, to accept, to endure. Tonight, I had fought back. Tonight, I had destroyed something precious to those who had destroyed so much in me. The fire burned through the night. By dawn, all that remained of the big house was a smoking ruin, blackened walls and collapsed beams. The beautiful white columns had crumbled. The expensive furniture was ash. The portraits of Whitfield ancestors were gone. Everything that had proclaimed the family's wealth and status had been reduced to rubble. Master Whitfield stood among the ruins, his face gray with shock and rage. He was shouting about arson, about finding who was responsible, about making them pay. The overseers moved through the quarters, questioning everyone, but the answers were all the same. We had been asleep. We had woken to the alarm. We had tried to help fight the fire. No one had seen anything suspicious. They came to question me, finding me sitting outside the quarters because the smoke had made it hard to breathe inside. I told them I had been asleep, that my back hurt too much to help with the water buckets. They looked at my scarred back, still marked from the whipping, and seemed to accept my story. After all, what could a crippled old woman do? They did not see me as capable of such an act. Their very contempt for me became my protection. Over the following days, investigators came from Richmond. They examined the ruins, looking for evidence of how the fire started. They questioned everyone on the plantation repeatedly. Suspicion fell on everyone and no one. Some suggested it was Union sympathizers, though there was no evidence of any outsiders being present. Others thought it might have been an accident, a spark from the kitchen hearth perhaps. The truth remained hidden, buried in the ashes, along with the Whitfield family's pride. I said nothing. I worked quietly, moving through my tasks with the same downcast eyes and submissive manner I had always shown. But inside, I burned with a fierce joy. I had done something that mattered. I had struck a blow against the system that had crushed so many of us, and I had survived. The days following the fire were chaos. The Whitfield family moved into the overseer's house, cramped and uncomfortable, their fine lifestyle reduced to simple quarters, not much better than what we lived in. Master Whitfield's rage was a constant presence, explosive and unpredictable. He took his frustration out on anyone within reach, his whip marking more backs than usual. But even in his fury, he could not rebuild what had been lost. The plantation had depended on the appearance of wealth and prosperity. The big house had been a symbol, a statement to other plantation owners and to society at large. Without it, the Whitfields looked diminished, almost pathetic. Creditors began to circle, demanding payment on loans that had been extended based on the plantation's perceived value. The war had already disrupted the cotton and tobacco markets, and now this disaster threatened to destroy them completely. I watched it all unfold with quiet satisfaction. This was more than just destroying a building. I had struck at the very foundation of their power, had exposed the fragility beneath their arrogance. They had seemed so untouchable, so permanent, but it took only one night to bring them low. The other enslaved people whispered among themselves about the fire. Some said it was divine justice, God's punishment for the cruelty we had endured. Others worried it would make things worse, that the masters would become even more brutal in their desperation. But there was also a new energy among us, a sense that perhaps the old order was not as solid as it seemed. If the big house could burn, what else might be possible? Martha and I never spoke directly about what I had done, but she stayed close to me during those difficult days, offering protection in small ways. When the overseers came around asking questions again and again, she would intercede, reminding them of my age and injuries, suggesting they focus their attention elsewhere. She spread word that I had been in terrible pain that night, had barely been able to sleep because of my back. Others corroborated the story, creating a web of protection around me. 2 weeks after the fire, news reached the plantation that changed everything. Union forces were advancing closer to Richmond. The war that had seemed so distant was now approaching our doorway. Master Whitfield called all the overseers together for urgent meetings, their voices carrying across the yard in heated debate. Some of the younger enslaved men began disappearing in the night, running toward the Union lines and the promise of freedom. The Whitfields tried to maintain control, but their authority was crumbling. Without the big house, without the resources to pay the overseers properly, without the certainty that the Confederate cause would prevail, the plantation began to fall apart. Some of the white workers left, seeking opportunities elsewhere. The fields went partially unharvested because there were not enough people to do the work, and those who remained moved slowly, no longer fearing punishment as they once had. I continued my work in what remained of the kitchen, now a temporary structure erected near the ruins of the old one. My body ached constantly, the years of hard labor and abuse taking their toll, but my spirit felt lighter than it had in decades. Every time I looked at the blackened ruins of the big house, I felt a surge of fierce pride. I had done that. Me, Junia Calhoun, an enslaved woman they had beaten and degraded, had brought down their monument to oppression. One evening in late October, as I sat outside the quarters watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and red, Martha joined me. She sat quietly for a while before speaking. "Things are changing fast," she said. "The war's coming here. Some people saying the Union Army's only a few days away." I nodded. "I've heard the same. You ever think about what you'll do if freedom comes? Where you'll go?" I considered the question. Freedom had seemed like such an impossible dream for so long that I had not allowed myself to really imagine it. "I don't rightly know," I admitted. "I've been property for so long, I hardly remember what it feels like to make my own choices." "You made a choice that night," Martha said quietly, her eyes on the ruined house. "That was your choice, and you carried it through. You're stronger than you know, Junia." Tears stung my eyes. I just couldn't take it anymore. The beating, the humiliation, being treated like I was nothing. I needed to do something, to fight back somehow. "I know," she said, "and you did. You stood up in the only way you could. That fire, it didn't just burn wood and cloth. It burned through some of the fear we all carry. People saw that the masters ain't untouchable, that their power can be challenged. We sat in silence as darkness fell, listening to the sounds of the plantation settling into night. But it was a different kind of silence now, filled with possibility rather than just oppression. The next morning, we woke to the sound of cannons in the distance. The Union Army was close enough that we could hear the artillery. Master Whitfield ordered everyone to continue working, but no one listened. We gathered in small groups, talking excitedly, wondering if this was finally the moment we had been waiting for. By afternoon, Confederate soldiers appeared on the road, retreating from the Union advance. They stopped briefly at the plantation, demanding food and supplies. Master Whitfield complied, his face pale with fear. The soldiers moved on quickly, and we were left in strange limbo, waiting for whatever came next. It came the following day. Union cavalry rode onto the plantation, their blue uniforms a shocking sight after years of seeing only Confederate gray. They assembled everyone in the yard, masters and enslaved people alike. An officer stood before us and read from a proclamation. "By order of the United States government and President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, all persons held in slavery in areas of rebellion are hereby declared free. You are no longer property. You are free men and women, with all the rights and protections that entails." The words seemed to hang in the air, too momentous to fully comprehend. Free. After 64 years of bondage, after a lifetime of suffering and degradation, I was free. Around me, people began to cry, to laugh, to embrace one another. Some fell to their knees in prayer. Others stood in stunned silence, unable to process what they were hearing. I looked across the yard at Master and Mistress Whitfield. They stood together, diminished and defeated, watching their world collapse around them. The plantation that had been in their family for generations was gone. The house I had burned was gone. The system that had given them power over other human beings was crumbling, and I had played my part in that destruction. Master Whitfield's eyes met mine across the distance. For just a moment, I saw something flicker in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, or suspicion. But it did not matter anymore. He had no power over me now. I was free, and nothing he could do would change that. I turned away from him, dismissing him from my thoughts as completely as he had dismissed my humanity for so many years. I walked over to where Martha stood, tears streaming down her weathered face. We embraced, two old women who had survived horrors that would have broken most people, now standing on the threshold of a new life. "We're free, Junia," she whispered. "We're actually free." "Yes," I said, my voice steady despite my own tears. "We are." Freedom, I learned quickly, was more complicated than simply being released from chains. The Union soldiers moved on after a few days, leaving us to figure out what freedom actually meant in practical terms. We had no money, no property, no place to go. Many of the formerly enslaved people chose to stay on the plantation, at least temporarily, because they had nowhere else to turn. The Whitfields offered wages for continued work, though the amounts were insultingly small and often went unpaid. I stayed for a few weeks, not because I wanted to, but because I needed time to recover my strength and plan my next steps. My back still hurt constantly, and my hip made walking difficult. At 64, I was not young enough to simply set out on the road with nothing but hope to sustain me. But every day I remained on that plantation felt like a betrayal of the freedom I had won. The ruins of the big house remained, a constant reminder of what I had done. Sometimes I would walk past them, looking at the blackened stones and collapsed timbers, and feel that surge of satisfaction again. I had struck a blow for all of us who had suffered here. That act of defiance had been my declaration of humanity, my refusal to accept their narrative that I was less than human. Martha and I talked often about the future during those transitional weeks. She had family in North Carolina who had been freed years earlier through their master's will. She was planning to travel there to reconnect with relatives she had not seen in decades. She urged me to come with her, but I was not sure that was my path. "I need to find my children," I told her one evening as we sat together outside the quarters we no longer had to call home. "I know it's been years, and they might not even remember me, but I need to try. They were sold to plantations in Georgia and Alabama. Maybe now I can find them." Martha's expression was sympathetic but cautious. "That's a hard road, Junia. The South is in chaos right now. Finding anyone is going to be near impossible, and you're not in the best health for traveling." "I know," I said, "but I have to try. I've spent my whole life being powerless, being unable to protect my own children. Now that I'm free, I need to at least try to find them, to let them know I never stopped thinking about them." She nodded slowly. "I understand. Just promise me you'll be careful. The war might be ending, but there's still a lot of dangerous people out there who don't accept that we're free." Her words proved prophetic. As November turned to December, reports reached us of violence against freed people throughout the South. Some former slaveholders were refusing to acknowledge emancipation, holding people in bondage through force and intimidation. Others were forming groups to terrorize freed people, to maintain white supremacy through violence since they could no longer maintain it through law. One afternoon, a group of former Confederate soldiers passed through the plantation. They were bitter about the war's outcome, angry at the loss of their way of life. They harassed the freed people still working there, shouting insults and threats. When one of the younger men stood up to them, they beat him severely, leaving him bloodied in the dirt. I watched from a distance, my hands clenched into fists. The rage I had felt the night I burned the house surged up again. We were supposed to be free, but these men still treated us as if we were nothing. Freedom on paper meant little when people were willing to use violence to deny it in practice. That night, I made my decision. I could not stay on this plantation any longer. Every day here was a reminder of what I had endured, and I needed to move forward, not remain trapped in the past. I would head south, toward Georgia, and search for my daughter Sarah, who had been sold when she was 12 years old. It had been 31 years, but I had to try. I spent the next week preparing for my journey. I had saved a few coins from the meager wages the Whitfields had paid, though it was barely enough for food for a few days. Martha gave me what she could spare from her own savings. Other freed people contributed bits of food, a blanket, words of encouragement and warning. The morning I left, Martha walked with me to the edge of the plantation. We stood together on the road, looking back at the place that had held us captive for so many years. The ruins of the big house were visible in the distance, a monument to destruction and resistance. "You did something powerful here, Junia," Martha said. "You showed them that we're not helpless, that we can fight back. Don't ever forget that." "I won't," I promised. "And you take care of yourself. Find your family and live the life you deserve." We embraced one last time, and then I turned and began walking south. Each step took me further from the plantation, further from the life of bondage I had known. My hip ached and my back hurt, but I kept moving. I was free, and I was choosing my own path for the first time in my life. The journey was harder than I had anticipated. The roads were crowded with people displaced by the war, both black and white. Some towns were welcoming to freed people, others hostile. I slept in abandoned buildings when I could find them, in the woods when I could not. I shared meals with other travelers, traded stories of where we had come from and where we hoped to go. Along the way, I heard countless tales of the war's end, of plantations abandoned, of families reunited, of violence and struggle. The South was being remade, though what it would become was still uncertain. The old order had fallen, but the new one was still taking shape, and the process was painful and often bloody. I also heard stories that echoed my own act of resistance. In South Carolina, enslaved people had burned their master's plantation before fleeing to Union lines. In Mississippi, a group of freed men had overpowered their former overseer and left him tied to a tree. Throughout the South, people who had been oppressed were striking back, claiming their humanity through action. These stories sustained me during the difficult journey. I was not alone in my anger, in my refusal to accept oppression quietly. We were a people rising up, asserting our right to freedom and dignity. The road ahead was uncertain and dangerous, but we were walking it together. After 3 weeks of travel, I reached the area in Georgia where I believed Sarah had been taken. I asked questions in every town, at every plantation, describing my daughter as I remembered her. A beautiful 12-year-old girl with bright eyes and a quick smile. Most people could not help, but they listened with sympathy, understanding the desperation of family members torn apart by slavery. Finally, in a small town outside Savannah, an elderly woman told me she knew of a woman named Sarah who matched my description. She had been enslaved on a nearby plantation, but had left shortly after emancipation, heading toward Savannah to look for work. It was a slim lead, but it was something. I made my way to Savannah, my body exhausted but my spirit determined. The city was crowded with freed people and Union soldiers, a chaotic mix of hope and uncertainty. I searched for weeks, asking everyone I met if they knew Sarah Calhoun. The search seemed hopeless, like looking for a single drop of water in the ocean. But then, on a cold January morning in 1864, I saw her. She was standing in a market, older now, 43 years old, but unmistakably my daughter. The shape of her face, the way she carried herself, it was all familiar despite the decades that had passed. "Sarah," I called out, my voice trembling. She turned, confusion in her eyes. She did not recognize me at first, and why would she? She had been 12 when we were torn apart, and I had aged hard under the weight of slavery. "My name is Junia Calhoun," I said, stepping closer. "I'm your mother." Recognition dawned slowly, followed by disbelief, then overwhelming emotion. We stood there in the market, tears streaming down both our faces, and embraced for the first time in 31 years. Sarah and I spent hours that first day catching up on the decades we had lost. She told me of her life on the Georgia plantation, of the hardships she had endured, of the 2 children she had borne who had been sold away from her just as she had been sold from me. The pain in her voice as she spoke of them broke my heart all over again. The cruelty of slavery had repeated itself across generations, stealing children from mothers, tearing families apart without mercy. She also told me about her husband, Marcus, a man she had met on the plantation who had been killed 2 years earlier for the crime of defending her when an overseer tried to assault her. The injustice of it, the casual brutality, was familiar to both of us. We had both survived horrors that would have crushed weaker souls. In turn, I told her my story. I spoke of the years at the Whitfield plantation, of the beating that had pushed me beyond endurance, and finally, I told her about the fire. Her eyes widened as I described how I had planned it, how I had watched the big house burn, how I had destroyed the symbol of our oppression. "You did that," she whispered. You actually burned down the master's house? I did, I confirmed. I couldn't take it anymore, Sarah. They had taken everything from me, including you. They had beaten me for spilling water, treated me like I was less than human. I needed to fight back, to show them that we're not just helpless victims. She was quiet for a long moment, processing what I had told her. Then she reached out and took my hands in hers. You were always strong, Mama. I remember that about you. Even after all these years, you never let them break your spirit completely. I came close, I admitted. So many times I came close, but something in me refused to give up entirely. And when the moment came, when I had the chance to strike back, I took it. We found a small room to rent in Savannah, pooling our limited resources. Sarah had been working as a laundress since gaining her freedom, and I helped as much as my injured back would allow. The work was hard, but it was our work, done for our own benefit. Every coin we earned was ours to keep, ours to spend as we chose. This was what freedom meant in practical terms. The right to our own labor, to make our own decisions, to build our own lives. As winter turned to spring in 1864, the war continued, though it was clear the Confederacy was losing. More freed people arrived in Savannah every week, fleeing plantations and seeking safety behind Union lines. Each person carried stories of suffering and resilience, of families torn apart and sometimes miraculously reunited. Sarah and I began attending meetings of freed people organized by Union officers and Northern abolitionists. They talked about education, about establishing schools so that we could learn to read and write, skills that had been denied to us under slavery. They spoke of voting rights, of citizenship, of building a new society where we would be recognized as fully human. At one of these meetings, I stood up and spoke for the first time about what I had done. I did not give details that would incriminate me legally, but I talked about the importance of resistance, of refusing to accept oppression quietly. I spoke of the fire I had set, framing it as a symbol of the larger fires of change burning throughout the South. They tried to make us believe we were nothing, I said, my voice carrying across the room. They beat us, worked us to death, sold our children, and told us it was the natural order of things. But we are not nothing. We are human beings with dignity and rights, and we have proven that through our resistance. Every person who ran away to freedom, every person who slowed their work in the fields, every person who stood up against their oppressor in whatever way they could, they all contributed to bringing down this evil system. The room erupted in affirmation, people calling out their agreement. Sarah sat in the front row, pride shining in her eyes. After the meeting, several people came up to me, wanting to hear more of my story. An elderly man shook my hand and said, "You did what many of us wished we could do. You struck back in a way that mattered." His words stayed with me. I had spent so long thinking of myself as just a survivor, someone who endured. But I was more than that. I was someone who had fought back, who had refused to accept oppression silently. That act of resistance, burning down the master's house, had been a declaration of my humanity, a refusal to be broken. As the months passed, news reached us of Union victories, of Confederate armies surrendering, of the war drawing to a close. In April 1865, we heard that General Lee had surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox. The war was over. The Confederacy had fallen. Slavery was ended not just by proclamation, but by the complete defeat of those who had fought to preserve it. The celebration in Savannah was overwhelming. Freed people poured into the streets, singing, dancing, crying tears of joy. Sarah and I stood together in the crowd, holding each other as we had not been able to do for so many years. We had survived. We had endured the worst that slavery could inflict, and we had lived to see it end. But even in the celebration, there was awareness that the struggle was not over. The war had ended slavery, but it had not ended racism or the desire of some whites to maintain their supremacy over us. Already, there were reports of violence against freed people in areas where Union troops were not present. The work of building true freedom and equality would be long and difficult. Sarah and I continued our lives in Savannah, working, building community, learning to read and write at the schools that were established for freed people. I was 65 years old, my body worn down by decades of hard labor and abuse, but my mind was sharp and eager. I absorbed knowledge like a dry sponge absorbs water. hungry for the education that had been denied to me for so long. We also continued searching for Sarah's children, my grandchildren. We wrote letters to aid societies helping to reunite families, posted notices in newspapers, asked everyone we met if they had information. The search was slow and often discouraging, but we persisted. Family was everything to us, and we would not give up hope of finding them. One evening, as we sat in our small room, reading by lamplight, Sarah looked up from her book and said, "Tell me again about the night of the fire. I want to remember every detail." So I told her again, describing the planning, the execution, the satisfaction of watching that symbol of oppression burn to the ground. She listened with absolute attention, and when I finished, she said, "I'm proud of you, Mama. What you did was dangerous and could have gotten you killed, but it was also brave. It was a way of fighting back when you had no other options. I want you to remember that story," I said. "And someday, when we find your children, I want you to tell them. I want them to know that their grandmother was not just a victim, but someone who fought for her dignity and freedom. I want them to know that we don't have to accept injustice quietly." She nodded seriously. "I will. I'll make sure they know the whole story, the suffering but also the resistance. They'll know what we survived and how we fought back." As I grew older, my health declined. The years of hard labor and the scars on my back took their toll. But I lived long enough to see the passage of the 13th Amendment, officially abolishing slavery throughout the United States. I lived long enough to see schools for freed people established across the South. I lived long enough to be reunited with Sarah and to know the joy of freedom, however limited and fragile it might be. I also lived long enough to see the beginning of what would later be called Reconstruction, the attempt to rebuild the South and establish true equality. It was a difficult and often violent process, with many white Southerners resisting change with every tool at their disposal. But there was also hope, moments when it seemed like real progress was possible. Sarah eventually found one of her children, a daughter named Ruth, who had been sold to a plantation in Alabama. The reunion was joyful and heartbreaking, another family partially mended after the devastation of slavery. Ruth came to live with us in Savannah, and I got to know my granddaughter, to see something of myself in her fierce independence and refusal to be diminished. I told Ruth my story, just as I had told Sarah. I wanted her to understand what we had survived, the price that had been paid for the freedom she now enjoyed. I wanted her to know that resistance was possible, that even in the darkest circumstances, people could fight back and make their actions count. "Your great-grandmother burned down the master's house," Sarah told Ruth one evening. "She stood up against people who tried to break her spirit, and she showed them that we are not helpless." Ruth looked at me with wonder in her young eyes. "You really did that, grandmother?" "I did," I confirmed, "and I would do it again. Sometimes when all other options are gone, you have to fight back in whatever way you can. You have to stand up for your dignity and humanity, no matter the cost." I passed away in 1867 at the age of 68 with Sarah and Ruth by my side. My body was tired, marked by a lifetime of suffering and hard work, but my spirit was at peace. I had lived to see slavery end. I had been reunited with my daughter. I had fought back against oppression and lived to tell about it. My last words to Sarah and Ruth were simple. Remember the fire. Remember that we fought back. Don't ever let anyone make you forget that we are strong, that we are human, that we deserve dignity and respect. And pass that story on, so that future generations understand the price of freedom and the necessity of resistance. Sarah kept that promise. She told my story to her children and grandchildren, to anyone who would listen. The tale of Junia Calhoun, the enslaved woman who burned down her master's house, became a piece of family history, passed down through generations. It became a reminder that even in the darkest times, resistance is possible, that ordinary people can commit extraordinary acts of courage, that the fight for justice and dignity is worth whatever price it demands. The fire I lit that September night in 1863 burned away more than just wood and cloth. It burned away some of the fear and helplessness that slavery had imposed on us. It was a declaration that we would not accept oppression silently, that we would fight for our humanity in whatever ways we could. and though the big house turned to ash, the spirit of resistance it represented lived on, passed down through the generations, a flame that could never be fully extinguished.